Morning class. This is ECON 353 macroeconomics class. Today is March 17th, Thursday.
The class will discuss the money, which is in the chapter 10 of your textbook. We are going to identify three functions of money, and we are going to list the various types of money and differences among them. We also discuss two different measures of U.S. money supply, M1 and M2. Also, we are going to determine which items are assets and which are liabilities on a bank's balance sheet. And we are going to distinguish among total excess and required reserves. Finally, we are going to discuss the functions of our central bank, the Federal Reserve. We identify the monetary policy tools of the Fed and how they are adjusted to increase or decrease the money supply. Here is the order of video clip that we are going to discuss today. 1. How goldsmiths created money. 2. Case study of cigarettes as money. 3. How banks create money. 4. The Federal Reserve System. 5. Hot topic issue about the reserve requirements, whether required reserve is necessary or not. Last, we are going to consider briefly money supply today and more detail on the next class period. Here is the first video clip.
If you want to understand money, you've got to start with its history, and that means gold. Have you ever wondered why gold is so valuable? I mean, it's a really weak metal that doesn't have a lot of practical uses. Maybe it's because it reminded people of the sun, which was worshipped in ancient times, that everyone decided they wanted it. And once everyone wants it, it's capable of serving as a medium of exchange. That is, gold can be used as money. And it's an ideal commodity to serve as a medium of exchange because it's portable, it's durable, it's divisible, and it's standardizable. Everybody recognizes what they want. It can be broken into little pieces, carried around. It doesn't rot. It's a great thing to serve as money. So before long, gold is circulating in the form of coins. And when gold circulates as coins, it's called commodity money. That is, money that has intrinsic value, made out of something that people want. Now, once gold coins begin to circulate as the medium of exchange, we've got another problem, and that problem is security. Imagine you're in the ancient world lugging around bags of gold. You're going to be pretty vulnerable to bandits. So what you want to do is make sure there's a safe place to store your gold, because you can store all of your wealth in the form of this valuable commodity, but you don't want it all lying around somewhere that's easy for someone else to pick off. So whoever it is in town that's the biggest and the strongest and has the most secure fort and the meanest dogs is well situated to serve the role of the protector of gold. Maybe he becomes the goldsmith. And the goldsmith begins by offering safekeeping services. So safekeeping services work this way. The goldsmith has a vault, and people come and they put their gold in the vault like this, and the goldsmith gives people receipts. And the receipts tell you how much you are able to withdraw from the goldsmith later. So if I put 10 pieces of gold into the vault, the goldsmith is going to give me a receipt for 10 pieces of gold. Now, the goldsmith could charge me a fee for this service because he is doing me a favor. But the goldsmith can also make money by taking the gold that's in the vault and lending it to other people. Think about how this works. So I want to borrow money to start a taco stand. And I go to the goldsmith and I say, I need some gold so I can pay the people who are building my factory. And he says, okay, I'll lend you some gold right now, but you've got to bring it back to me later with interest. So since more gold goes back in the vault than came out, the goldsmith can take part of it as his profit. So the goldsmith can make money by lending gold to others. Now, a problem can arise here, of course, if the goldsmith starts lending out money and then everybody comes and they want their gold back and there's no gold there. That's called a run on the bank. But one thing that makes that relatively unlikely is called synchronization. That is, think about the way people behave as far as deposits and withdrawals are concerned. People deposit and withdraw from the bank in a kind of predictable fashion. And if I go to the goldsmith on a particular day and I want to withdraw some of my gold, chances are that somebody came by earlier that day, or maybe the previous day, and deposited gold. So the goldsmith, rather than digging in and finding the coins that I actually put in, can give me the gold that the guy left there the day before. So as long as deposits are well synchronized with withdrawals, the goldsmith can take the bulk of this gold and lend it out, keeping a relatively small amount on hand if people come in and want to withdraw. And then, in the meantime, rely on synchronization. That is, gold flows in and out in some predictable way. Well, let's think more about what the goldsmith could do. Because rather than actually lend out the gold coins, the goldsmith has another strategy. And that strategy arises because this receipt that I got for gold may actually begin to circulate as money itself. Think about this. If everybody knows that the goldsmith is reliable, and if these receipts can't be counterfeited easily, that is, they have to have the goldsmith's thumbprint on them or something like that, then whenever I want to buy something, I don't actually have to go get my gold out of the vault at all. I can just give you the receipt. Now, you're entitled to go make the withdrawal yourself whenever you want. So the goldsmith's receipts begin to circulate as money. They become a medium of exchange. The gold here that's in the vault is the commodity, but the receipt is representative. And because it's representative, people will accept it. That means that the goldsmith doesn't have to lend out gold at all. What he can do is, if you want to borrow money from the goldsmith can just give you a receipt directly so that you can go out and spend it like money. You give the goldsmith an IOU, which shows up in his vault, and he gives you a receipt, which you go out and spend. Now, anybody who wants to can take this receipt, bring it to the goldsmith, and cash it in for gold. Right? So the goldsmith now has to be careful how many of these receipts that he issues. Because if he should get overstretched, that is, if the goldsmith starts issuing lots of receipts, lots more receipts than he has in gold, he's now vulnerable to a run on his bank. That is, I hear the goldsmith is issuing a lot of receipts. We're seeing a lot of receipts out there. I don't think he has a gold. Then everybody's going to go bring their receipts at once, come to the goldsmith, take all of his gold, and break the bank. And that's the end of the goldsmith. So, you see the problem. This problem helps us understand a basic concept in the financial system, and that's the concept of fractional reserve banking. That is, money circulates, whether in the form of receipts for gold, or whether in the modern world in the form of checking accounts and currency. But if there aren't reserves to back those, and in particular, in the case of checking accounts, if the bank is creating a lot of checking accounts because it wants to be issuing loans so it can earn interest, if the bank is creating checking accounts and doesn't have dollar bills to back it, then they're subject to the same kind of problems that the overeager goldsmith is once he's issued all these receipts. Now this raises an interesting question, and that is, what is a dollar bill backed by? Right? I've got dollar bills here in my wallet. What is it that determines their value? Can I take this and cash it in for gold? Absolutely not. The Federal Reserve that issues this currency will no longer trade it for gold. In fact, private households haven't been able to get gold from the Fed since the Great Depression. What is it that determines this value of the dollar? The value of the dollar, because it's not based on anything that's actually backing it, depends on other people's willingness to accept it. And ultimately, that value is grounded in two things. First of all, the government requires that you hold it to pay taxes. And second, it is legal tender. That is, if I pay a debt with it, then you can't sue me in court for non-payment. But it all goes back, the basic idea of the way the banking system works, all goes back to the goldsmith. The goldsmith starts with safekeeping, then begins making loans, then finds himself the custodian of the community's money supply, because his receipts begin to circulate as money. That puts him in the position of wanting to issue enough of these receipts that he makes full profit off of his lending activities, but not so much that he makes people afraid that he can't actually back his receipts with gold. This is the basic idea behind the modern banking system, a fractional reserve system where checking accounts have to be backed with reserves. We're going to see shortly how that fractional reserve banking system works in the modern financial system. The main problem in a barter economy is the need for double coincidence of wants. I've got cheese and I want chocolate. That means I've got to find a trading partner who has chocolate and wants cheese, and you can spend a lot of time looking. In order to reduce these search costs, people eventually begin to accept and exchange almost any good that is portable, durable, divisible, standardizable, and in broad enough demand that people know that they can get rid of it anytime they want to trade for something else. That is, what I'll do is I'll trade my cheese for salt, because chances are I'll eventually find somebody who has chocolate and is willing to accept salt in exchange, because he knows he can turn around and trade that salt for what he wants very shortly. This is how commodity money is brought into being. People began to use some commodity as a medium of exchange in order to reduce search costs, and eventually some commodity begins to circulate that's convenient to use and has all the good properties of money. That brings up the question, what can you do with your cigarettes after you quit smoking? Well, if you're in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II, you might have used cigarettes for money. Cigarettes began to circulate as money quite naturally in order to solve the problem of double coincidence of wants. The Red Cross brought care packages into the prisoner of war camps and gave prisoners little packages that included chocolate, cheese, other goods, and cigarettes. So if you didn't want cigarettes and you didn't want chocolate, you could make a trade. But if you had cheese and wanted chocolate, you could trade your cheese for cigarettes, knowing that eventually you'd be able to trade the cigarettes for chocolate when you found the right trading partner. Cigarettes began to circulate as money, the medium of exchange. They also began to fulfill the other roles that money plays, a unit of account. That is, prices began to be quoted in cigarettes. It cost 80 cigarettes to buy a shirt, or 2 cigarettes to get a shirt laundered. Also, cigarettes began to be used as a store of value. People would hoard cigarettes as a kind of savings and spend them whenever they needed to buy something. So cigarettes were a kind of commodity money, circulating, being saved, and being used as a unit of account. What can we learn from the experience of German POW camps? Well, first of all, they were not unique by any means. We have prisons now in the United States in which cigarettes circulate as money all the time because there aren't dollar bills available there. And to solve the double coincidence of wants, prisoners use cigarettes as money. Even people who don't smoke cigarettes will accept cigarettes in exchange because they know they can spend them whenever they want something. Also, cigarettes circulated in the countries of the former Soviet Union after the collapse of the ruble in the early 1990s. Because the government was printing so much money and sparking inflation, people were afraid to hold rubles, and therefore an underground economy developed in which cigarettes were the commodity money and began to be used as a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. So, anytime people find that commodities serve them better as money than the actual paper money of the government, they'll shift and use commodities instead. Well, this raises the prospect that even in the United States, we could decide to use commodity money instead of the Federal Reserve notes. I mean, that could happen any time. The only reason we're so committed to Federal Reserve notes is, first of all, they're very convenient to use because everyone will accept them everywhere. But the reason that's true is, first of all, they're legal tender. The government says that any contract you settle with dollars is settled, and therefore you can't be sued for breach or non-payment. The second thing is that the Internal Revenue Service accepts payment of taxes only in dollars. So you've got to have dollars to pay your taxes, and that creates a demand for that paper money. However, if you and I are doing business among each other, we might settle our account in any way that's convenient for us to do so. So why not commodity money beginning to arise in the United States today? Probably not cigarettes, because cigarettes aren't as convenient as dollars. But what about frequent flyer miles or long-distance telephone minutes? I mean, don't these have all the same properties as money? They are measured in numbers. They're very easy to carry around. They can be stored on a computer chip, on a magnetized strip on a card. I mean, they work just like money, except they have the added value that they are inherently valuable. They're good for their own sake. They're commodity money, as opposed to the fiat money, which has value because the government says that it does. So you can imagine a money system beginning to be organized around frequent flyer miles or long-distance telephone minutes. Now, the Fed would probably find this to be an undesirable development because it's going to be harder to control the money supply when the money supply is effectively being controlled by airlines and telecommunications companies and being controlled by private operations. Because of this, the Fed then might demand that those different kinds of commodities be controlled in a particular way so as to prevent inflation and instability in the economy. That is, the Fed would get involved in the business of those particular commodities. So that's one thing. The loss of control of the money supply is one fear that comes with a shift to a commodity system. The other thing is that once transactions begin to occur in terms of those commodities, they're a little bit harder to tax. So the Internal Revenue Service would want to get involved in this development as well. But you can imagine it makes really very little difference whether your bank account is measured, whether those numbers represent dollars or whether they represent frequent flyer miles. The system would work exactly the same either way. And the commodity money is always going to be appealing because it represents something of real and final value. So the Fed has to watch out because a private money system can pop up anytime, just like the cigarettes began to create a money system after World War II, and just like the cigarettes began to be used as money when the Soviet Union fell apart. Anytime a commodity money system can arise if people find it easy and convenient to use. Although the Federal Reserve has a lot of control over the money supply, most of the money that's out there is created by banks. And the process by which banks create money is nothing short of magic. To understand the way banks create money, remember that bank reserves put a limit on the number of new checking accounts that banks can create. Anytime a bank makes a loan, the bank makes the loan by creating a checking account. That is, the loan is an asset of the bank, money that's owed the bank, on which the bank is earning interest. And the checking account is a liability. The Federal Reserve watches checking accounts because they're part of the money supply, part of what people use to go shopping. So there's a restriction on the creation of new checking accounts. And that restriction is that for every new dollar that banks create in checking accounts, they have to have reserves equal to 10 cents. And reserves have to be held in the form either of cash or reserve deposits, that is, the bank's own deposits at the Fed. Now, once you understand that there's a reserve requirement, the process by which banks create money becomes very, very interesting and ends up with the concept that we call the money multiplier. The money multiplier explains how a little bit of action from the Fed can create a lot of new money in the banking system. Let's see how it works. Suppose you, a securities dealer, decides to do a transaction with the Fed. You sell a security to the Fed, and the Fed gives you a check. Now, you take that check to your bank, and let's suppose your bank is called Bank A. Let's look at how the deposit of that check shows up on the bank's balance sheet. Here on this T account, I'll put bank assets on the left and bank liabilities on the right. Suppose the check you deposit is for $1,000. Well, the first thing that happens is the bank has a new liability. That is, the bank owes you $1,000, which is the amount of money that you put into your checking account. And we're going to call you person number 1. When the bank takes the check that you deposited and presents it to the Fed can do one of two things. Either the Fed can give the bank cash, or the Fed can give the bank credit in that bank's reserve account at the Fed. Either way, Bank A winds up with an increase in its reserves of $1,000. So the $1,000 checking deposit winds up as an increase in bank reserves because It's coming from the Fed. The bank takes the check to the Fed and gets reserves in exchange. Now, the bank has some thinking to do. It's got $1,000 in reserves, but only 1,000 new dollars in checking. So, since the bank only needs to hold a fraction of this as a legal reserve requirement, it can lend out the rest. And let's see how the bank does the calculation. The bank says to itself, we got $1,000 in new checking times a required reserve ratio of 10% means that we've got to hold $100 as required reserves. That means that if we subtract that $100 from our $1,000 of reserves, $900 of that reserve is lendable. And the bank, by golly, is going to lend it out as soon as it can because it's only the loan that earns interest. The reserves earn no interest. So the bank very quickly makes a loan, and that's going to increase its loan portfolio by $900. So $900 in loan is created, and the bank creates the loan by giving somebody a new checking account. Let's say Jane comes in and she wants to expand her bakery, and she needs to buy a new oven that costs $900, so she borrows the money from the bank. The bank gives her a checking account, and she writes a check to the appliance company that brings the new oven to her store. Now, what happens when that occurs? Jane withdraws the money from her checking account, so her checking balances of $900 are drawn down to zero. Meanwhile, the bank that the appliance company uses brings Jane's check back to Bank A and wants to clear it somehow. It can either be cleared by giving the new bank cash or by giving the new bank $900 worth of Bank A's reserves at the Fed. Either way will do. Whatever happens, Bank A winds up with $900 less in its reserve account than it had before. Now, let's look at what's happened on net here. After all the dust has settled and Bank A has done its business, the net result is that $1,000 in reserves came in, $900 in reserves went out. The net increase in reserves at Bank A is $100. Meanwhile, Bank A has had a net increase in checking deposits of $1,000. It created an account for Jane, but Jane withdrew it immediately, leaving your account as the net change in checking, $1,000. And if we take the ratio of the change in reserves to the change in checking, that ratio is equal to 10%. We say that Bank A is now loaned up because they can't legally make any more loans without violating their reserve requirement. But notice, the interesting step is this step right here. This is the step where Bank A created money. That is, Bank A created money that didn't exist previously just by the stroke of a pen. By making a loan to Jane and giving Jane a checking account, Bank A created new money. And this money is added to the money supply. I'm going to set this money aside because in a minute I'm going to ask how much money is created in total by the time we reach the end of the story. So we'll put the money created by Bank A over here on the side and bring it back in a minute. Meanwhile, let's follow this $900 in reserves that left Bank A and wound up at Bank B, the bank of the appliance dealer from which Jane bought her new stove. Let's consider how that works. The appliance dealer brings in a check from Jane for $900. And the appliance dealer we're going to call person number 3. Well, Bank B took that check to Bank A, as we saw before, and acquired $900 in new reserves. Well, now Bank B has a calculation to do. Bank B asks itself, how much of this money do we have to hold and how much of it can we lend? Well, our new checking account is $900, so 900 times 10% is 90. It takes $90 of reserves to back this checking account. Subtract 90 from 900, and that means that Bank B can create a loan equal to $810. And Bank B is eager to do that as soon as it can, so it doesn't lose a moment's worth of interest. So let's suppose Jack comes in, and he wants to take a vacation, and he's going to borrow money from Bank B. So Bank B creates a checking account for Jack. He's person number 4. And what happens next is Jack takes his checkbook to his travel agent, writes a check for $810. The travel agent presents the money to his bank. His bank shows up at Bank B and wants reserves to clear the check. So $810 worth of reserves flow out of Bank B to make Jack's check good. Well, what's the net result of all this action at Bank B? The net result is $900 worth of reserves came in, $810 flowed out to clear Jack's check, and the net change in reserves is $90. The net change in checking is that $900 that the appliance dealer brought in. And the ratio of the change in reserves to the change in checking is 10%. Again, the most interesting thing on this T account is right here, the step when Bank B created some new money. Money that didn't previously exist, that they created by making a checking account for Jack. So, let's put this money over to the side. Now, by now you get the point. I could go on and on. Bank C would have the same setup and the same numbers, only they would be 90% of these numbers. And Bank D would have numbers that are 90% of those. So by now, we're ready to ask the question, how much does the money supply change in response to that security that you sold to the Fed? You sold $1,000 security to the Fed, you got a $1,000 check, you deposited in your bank, and you set in motion a chain reaction. What's the total change in the money supply? Well, the total change in the money supply is going to be equal to, first of all, the money that came from the Fed. And the money that came from the Fed was $1,000. So we'll put $1,000 out here. Then there was the money that was created by Bank A when Bank A made that loan to Jane, and that was $900. So we'll put $900 right here. Then there was the money that was created by Bank B when they made the loan to Joe, and that was $810. Sorry, I think it was Jack they made a loan to, but it was the same amount of money. And Bank C creates a loan of $729. So we'll put it out here, and it just keeps going. Each number is 90% of the number before. Why? Because banks are able to lend out 90% of the new reserves they get. Well, that means the total is going to be 1,000 plus 900 plus 810 plus 729 and so forth. And if you add all of this up, Bank D, E, F, and so on for infinity, you get 10,000. 10 times the original amount of money. Now, how do we know that? We know it, first of all, because you could do it by brute force, just adding up the numbers forever. But the easier way is, we've got a geometric sequence here. The geometric sequence is, the net change in the money supply is equal to 1,000 times 1, which came from the Fed, plus 90%, which was created by Bank A, plus 90% of 90%, or 81%, which was created by Bank B, and so forth. And anytime you've got a geometric sequence like this, it has an easy, simple expression. It's 1 over 1 minus whatever this term is. In this particular case, it's 1 over 1 minus the fraction that banks are allowed to lend. And the fraction that banks are allowed to lend is 1 minus the required reserve ratio. In our case, the required reserve ratio is 10%, so the fraction that banks are allowed to lend is 90%. And that gives you insight into the money multiplier. The money multiplier is simply 1 over 1 minus the required reserve ratio, or the change in the money supply that results from a change in reserves, and that comes from anything the Fed buys, is equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if the required reserve ratio is 10%, the money multiplier is 10. If the required reserve ratio is 50%, then it's 1 over 1/2, the money multiplier is 2. The bigger the required reserve ratio, the more money each bank has to keep in its own vault, and the less it can lend, the fewer new checking accounts it can create. The smaller the required reserve ratio, the more banks can lend, and the more easily they can create checking accounts, turning a small amount of new reserves into a big increase in the money supply. So if we take all those little pieces of money that we started with and add them up, here's the amount that was created for Jane, here's the amount that was created for Jack, here's the amount that was created in the next stage, and the next stage, and the next stage, until the pieces are too small to add up. The end result is the total change in the money supply. And the total change in the money supply is going to be the original change from the Fed multiplied by the money multiplier, which is 1 over the required reserve ratio. Suppose you have the printing presses for money for your town. Isn't that a great position to be in? Anytime you want something, you just go print out new dollar bills, take them to the store, and buy it and pay. Now, if, however, you print too many of these dollar bills and buy too many things, what you're going to do is your money is going to become so plentiful that it's going to begin to lose value. Prices in your town start to rise, you've got to print more money to buy anything, and before long you've got inflation out of control. Then nobody wants to hold money, and people revert to barter to protect themselves because money becomes worthless so fast as prices are rising. On the other hand, if you control the printing presses for your town and you don't print enough money, then there's not enough money in circulation to keep the wheels of business running smoothly. People have to go out and look for trading partners. They're going to start scrambling to get money. Interest rates are going to go up. Business is going to be hard to do. And before too long, stores are going to start closing and the town slips into a recession. See, you've got a fine line to walk, and now you've got some sympathy for the position of the Federal Reserve System, the monetary authority for the U.S. economy. Now, the Fed has to figure out how much money to make available so that we don't get too much and inflation or too little and recession. But underneath all of it, there's still that wonderful fact that the Fed gets to print money anytime it wants to buy something, and that the Fed, in some sense, gets its money for nothing. Now, let's think about where the Fed came from. In 1907, there was a severe banking panic in the United States because banks tended to print too much money. That is, when the gold was deposited and banks issued private currency, they would tend to issue too much currency for a given amount of gold. People, becoming fearful that there wasn't enough gold to redeem bank notes with, would make a run on the bank. The bank would run out of gold and would shut down. And when banks shut down, we got recessions and panics. So, in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act to create a central banking authority that would regulate banks and require them to behave in such a way that panics would be less common. That is, banks would have to hold reserves and banks would have to follow good business practice. The Federal Reserve System is organized as followed. There are about 4,000 commercial banks in the United States that are members of the Federal Reserve System, and together they own the 12 Federal Reserve banks. The U.S. is divided into 12 Federal Reserve districts, and each district has its own Federal Reserve Bank. The presidents of those 12 Federal Reserve banks play a role in the shaping of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System is overseen by the Board of Governors, 7 men and women appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And at the top of the pyramid is the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, appointed by the President for a 4-year term. That chairman gets to set the agenda for the Federal Reserve meetings and is always visible in the press, his or her every move scrutinized as the stock market and bond traders and everybody else tries to figure out if the Fed's going to tighten the money supply and push up interest rates or make money more plentiful, credit easier to get, and potentially create a risk of inflation. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee is the most important monetary policy-making body. It consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors and 5 members that are drawn from the presidents of the Federal Reserve banks. Each president is on the committee in some years and off the committee in other years, so that in any given year there are 12 members of the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee meets every 6 weeks to determine whether the Fed is going to make money easier to get and lower rates, or make money harder to get and raise interest rates. Now, you wonder, how does this work? How does the Fed have influence over the money supply? Later, we're going to talk about the specific policy tools that the Fed has to influence the money supply. But let's go ahead and start with the intuition of where money comes from and the Fed's role in creating it. Suppose the Fed wants to buy something, like a Treasury bill. The Fed wants to add a Treasury bill, that is a little piece of the government debt, to its stock of assets. In order to pay for it, the Fed prints money, maybe currency, and goes to the open market, pays currency, so that currency now goes into circulation, and the Fed gets a Treasury bill for free. So, the outstanding dollar bill is a liability of the Fed. This is a claim on the Federal Reserve System. And the asset that the Fed purchased is the Treasury bill. Anytime the Fed buys something, it pays with a liability that it created. And the liabilities of the Federal Reserve System are the base of the money supply of the United States. Now, let's think first of all about the things that the Fed might buy. What are the assets of the Fed? First of all, Treasury bills. The Fed owns about $400 billion worth of United States government debt. That's about a tenth of the total national debt. And the interest on the debt that the Fed holds more than pays the expenses of operating the Fed. So the Fed is pretty much independent of the government. It doesn't depend on Congress for regular allocations of funds. Also, the Fed makes loans to insured depositories, that is, to credit unions and savings and loan associations and commercial banks. And the Fed receives interest on those loans. The Fed also holds a lot of gold, and the Fed holds foreign currency. In addition, something else that's interesting about the Fed buys coins from the U.S. Treasury and eventually puts those coins into circulation by sending them to the banks that rely on the Fed's coin and currency delivery services. Now, how does the Fed pay for these assets? It pays, first of all, by printing money and putting that money into circulation. There's about $400 billion worth of currency in circulation, and the Fed put every dollar of it into circulation by buying something. Another way that the Fed can pay for stuff is by giving banks credit at the Fed. The accounts that banks hold at the Federal Reserve are called reserve accounts. So the reserve deposits that the Fed credits banks with, kind of like the checking account of banks at the Fed, these are a liability of the Fed because banks can come in and withdraw them in the form of cash or some other asset whenever they want. The Fed also has a special account for foreign central banks that it uses for doing foreign exchange transactions that influence the value of the dollar. And the Fed has an account called the U.S. Treasury General Account, through which the Fed does transactions with the United States government. Now, the most important two liabilities are currency and reserve deposits, because the amount of currency and reserve deposits that the Fed creates determines how much money banks can create in new loans by a process that we're going to examine later. The most important thing, though, is to see that anytime the Fed buys something, whether it's gold or a treasury bill, the Fed is going to be influencing the supply of money in the United States. There's one more service that the Fed provides that's pretty interesting, and that's the service of clearing checks. Checks clear through the Federal Reserve's check clearing service, which is a network of computers and wires and member banks, so that if I receive a check from you and it's written on a bank that's not my bank, I take the check to my bank, and my bank works through accounts at the Federal Reserve System so that money is transferred from your bank to mine when it goes into my account. And that system is run by the Federal Reserve. The Fed also runs FedWire, which wires money among financial institutions when you want to make a quick transfer. And the Fed provides coin and currency delivery service, as well as an opportunity to make emergency loans to any bank that is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We're going to be looking now at the specific policy tools that the Fed uses to influence the money supply. banking just gets more and more competitive. Nowadays, banks have to worry not only about competition from foreign banks opening branches in this country, but insurance companies and stock companies and mutual funds are now offering services that substitute for the services offered by banks. Therefore, to stay in business, banks are always looking for ways to increase their revenue, expand their customer base, and shrink their costs. One of the big costs associated with banking is the cost of holding reserves. Bank reserves include cash held in the vault and money on deposit at the Federal Reserve System. These reserves earn zero interest, and the bank would rather take this money and lend it out to some business that would pay interest rather than hold it as reserves. Banks hold reserves, however, because it's necessary to have a certain amount of cash on hand, just in case people want to take a lot out of their checking accounts on a particular day. However, the Federal Reserve System requires banks, by law, to hold 10 cents in reserves for every $1 that the bank has offered in checking accounts. It's a legal requirement. So, we might ask ourselves, what is this law accomplishing? Can we not rely on the free market to give us the right amount of reserves? Don't banks best know how much to hold in reserves to do their business well? Or do we really need a law? Consider the question, are reserve requirements necessary? Are they accomplishing something for the economy? Let's think about this question from two perspectives. The first perspective concerns risk. The reason banks hold reserves is in case synchronization fails. Synchronization means that on a given day, people are depositing about as much money as they're withdrawing. Therefore, the bank doesn't have to hold a lot in reserves. It can take the money that you've deposited and give it to me when I come in to make a withdrawal. This allows the bank to devote the bulk of its funds to long-term investments that pay high rates of interest. However, if on a particular day, maybe due to a big shopping sale or something like that, a bunch of people come in to make withdrawals from the bank has to scramble to come up with cash that hasn't been deposited that day. That means going down to the vault and taking out the reserves. Well, if it doesn't have the reserves, the bank finds itself in trouble. And the Federal Reserve System wants to make sure that banks, as a rule, don't get in this position very often. Why? Because when one bank finds itself having to shut its doors, saying that it can't meet the demand for liquidity on that particular day, customers of all the other banks in town get scared that maybe their bank is in the same position. Next thing you know, the whole banking system, which depends on the depositor's confidence, is under siege. We've got a systemic problem. This is a kind of like, you can decide if you want to smoke or not, whether you want to put your own lungs at risk, but if you smoke in a crowded room, you're making a choice that puts other people at risk as well. And this is a reason why there may be a law that prohibits it. So the reserve requirement is a kind of law that keeps banks from taking risks that might impose costs on other banks. However, in some ways, there's no need to be quite as scared about this as we might once have been. That's because banks can get money pretty quickly if they need it. A bank that is solvent, that has enough assets to back its liabilities, can always get cash for the short term by borrowing from another bank, or even in an extreme case, borrowing from the Fed itself. So, all we have to be worried about is whether the bank is solvent or not. And the bank is typically going to be solvent because the managers of the bank have put enough of their own capital at stake that they're going to make sure the bank is well managed and not taking extraordinary risks that could jeopardize the solvency of the bank. So, if banks can borrow money anytime they run into a short-run failure of synchronization, a liquidity crunch, then maybe the reserve requirement is not so necessary after all. The second perspective from which to think about this is the concern about the stability of monetary policy. What the Federal Reserve wants to do is to create a steady demand for reserves so that it can provide more reserves when it wants to allow banks to make more loans and increase the money supply, and provide fewer reserves when it wants to put banks in the position of having to call in loans and shrink the money supply. By creating a mandatory reserve requirement, the Fed creates a stable demand for reserves, which allows it then to manipulate the money supply with some regularity and security. If we allow banks to decide how much they want to hold reserves for themselves, they're going to hold the amount of reserves that minimizes the risk of not having money to give your depositors when they come in to take out of their checking accounts. Now, the amount of money that banks have to hold as a cushion is going to depend on the way in which deposits and withdrawals are timed. At a particular time of the year, when there's a lot of shopping being done, there may be a lot more withdrawals than there are deposits. At other times of the year, there might be a lot of deposits and fewer withdrawals. And sometimes there are surprising events like a crop failure or the closing of a factory or a special unannounced sale that suddenly change the demand for money. And if the demand for money changes unpredictably, the banks may have to very quickly try to adjust their holding of reserves to avoid a liquidity crisis. Well, if we're letting the banks do all of this based on their own best judgment, then what the Fed is going to say is, we don't know how much reserves banks want to hold. The demand for reserves is going to vary one week to the next, and that makes it harder for us to maintain a stable interest rate, that is, to supply the amount of money that meets the demand for money. Well, is this a big problem? Can the Fed be flexible enough? Can banks be flexible enough? We can look at the example from some other economies, the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand, all three of which have no legal reserve requirement on banks. And yet, they have a banking system that is as safe as the banking system in the United States, and their monetary policy has been conducted with relative stability. That is, it doesn't seem to have been a huge problem for the central bank of those countries to provide money to meet the increased demand and to bring the money back in when demand goes slack. So it just requires a little bit more flexibility. Sure, a reserve requirement creates a steady demand for reserves, but if the central bank is flexible, it can provide extra money when demand is up and pull it back out of the economy when demand goes down. So it's an interesting question. We can't say for sure one side or the other, but as a rule, it's generally good to let the market solve problems rather than law, as a rule, unless you can make a compelling argument for why the law is necessary, either to control events that impose risks on others or things like that. Then let the market make the decision. Let the banks and the other actors in the financial system decide what's the right amount of reserves for a good bank to hold to do its business well. On the other hand, still concerns about the systemic nature of risk in the banking system and fears about policy being conducted in an orderly and reliable way mean that reserve requirements will probably persist for a while longer. Imagine a world without money. How would you get the things that you want and need? Suppose you're a canoe maker and you want a chicken. Well, what you're going to have to do is make a canoe, then you're going to have to carry it around looking for somebody who's got a chicken. And when you find him, you have to hope that he wants a canoe. Then you've got to decide how many chickens is a canoe worth, will you exchange for, then do the transaction and carry your chickens home. It's very, very inconvenient, and with all of these search costs and effort to find trading partners, you're probably not going to spend nearly as much time actually making canoes and creating things of value. Eventually what happens in an economy like this, an economy that depends on barter, is that some good begins to circulate as a medium of exchange. Suppose that everyone wants salt. So you've made a canoe, you can trade it for salt. Then eventually you find somebody who's got chickens. He may not want a canoe, but he wants salt. So the trade is pretty easy to do. A medium of exchange lowers the search costs. Plus, what happens is all prices begin to be quoted in terms of salt. Rather than having to figure out how many chickens a canoe is worth, the salt acts as a kind of common denominator. It's called a unit of account. A third thing that happens is if salt can be stored, you can sell your stuff for salt, put salt in your warehouse, and spend the salt when you want stuff in the future. That is, it can be a store of value. Now you've got something that's functioning as money. Money is anything that is commonly accepted in exchange for goods and services. That is, anything that's actually used and accepted for shopping. Now, let's be very clear about the way the term money is used. When we talk about money, we are usually talking about exchange. That is, things that can be traded. Whenever you say money, you might talk about the money you have in the bank, that is, the value that you have stored up. But typically, when economists are talking about money, we're concerned about those tools that are used in society to make shopping easier to do. The functions of money are unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. Now, the earliest forms of money, like salt, are all commodities, things that are valuable for their own sake. Commodities, cattle, wine, tobacco. In fact, some places in the world today, occasionally, when the paper money is worthless, people will still use cigarettes in transactions. Maybe to pay for a cab ride. Or in prisons, often cigarettes circulate as money, are commonly accepted in trades. What is it, though, that's going to be the best kind of money? The best kind of money is going to be durable, that is, it doesn't melt or rot. It's going to be portable, easy to carry around. It's going to be standardizable, that is, everyone can look at it and clearly see it's valuable. And it's going to be divisible, that is, it's pretty easy to make change from. So, what's going to be ideal? What commodity best serves? Well, one commodity that's pretty good is gold or any of the other precious metals. Actually, in antiquity, people probably thought that this gold and silver and other precious metals were valuable because it reminded them of the celestial bodies, which many of them saw as signs of the divine. Once these things are commonly accepted and agreed upon as valuable, then you can cut them up into standard sizes and make coins that can circulate as money. Pretty easy to carry around, and everybody knows they're good. Now, one problem with this is a sack full of gold is pretty heavy. So what's about to happen in history is we're going to witness the evolution in the ancient world from people actually carrying commodities around to carrying around pieces of paper that represent claims on the commodities. So you put all of your gold with the goldsmith somewhere, he gives you a certificate that stands for gold, and now you can pay in shopping with the certificate. Representative money. Once people are accepting pieces of paper, the next step is that you don't need any gold to back it. That is, the government simply says this money is valuable. This is a movement from commodity money and representative money to what we call fiat money, money that gets its value from the word of law. Now, the way the government gives money value is, first, it requires that you hold this money to pay your taxes, and the Army stands behind that, so unless you want to run afoul of the structures of authority, you've got to agree that this is valuable, and you've got to come up with some at tax time. The second thing the government can do is it can declare that this is legal tender. Legal tender means that it's good for settling debts. If I owe you money and I give you legal tender, then you can't sue me because the government will throw out your claim in court because I settled it with an instrument that everyone says, by law, has to be accepted. That's what fiat money is all about. Now, why should we care about money? Money makes transactions easier to do, and if there's enough money, then business proceeds normally. If there's too little money, then people revert towards something kind of like barter. They don't specialize, they don't trade, and in the modern world we call that a recession. The economy slows down when money and credit are difficult to get, and business activity slacks off, employment is down, and we get a recession. On the other hand, if the government is printing and circulating too much money, then we've got too much money chasing too few goods, and that creates inflation, an excess supply of money that drives up prices. So there's a fine line to walk between too little money and a recession and credit crunch, and too much money and inflationary pressure, rising prices. So the Federal Reserve is the monetary authority of the United States. It's charged with making sure there's not too much money and not too little money. That is, it's charged to making sure that money retains its value by prices remaining stable. That means the Fed has got to make sure that there's just enough money. So that raises a question. If the Fed is trying to measure money, what in practice is it actually measuring? What is money? And this question has several answers, depending on who is willing to accept something in exchange for goods and services. Let's think about a very, very narrow measure of money. What is the stuff that everyone's willing to take in transactions? What can you use to pay for your groceries? What will the pizza boy accept whenever he delivers your pizza? The answer is cash. Everybody will take currency. Everyone will take coins. And most people will take personal checks and traveler's checks. If you add up currency and coins in circulation, the total sum of personal checking accounts and business checking accounts, and you throw in traveler's checks, you've got a measure of money that the Federal Reserve calls M1. This is the narrowest measure of the money supply, and in the U.S. economy it adds up to about $1 trillion. Now, let's make the measure of money a little bit broader. Let's include other things that we might call near money. The Fed's concern here is how much stuff is actually out there circulating through the economy to make shopping possible. That is, how much shopping are people capable of doing with the existing money supply? So the Fed is now going to say, well, this is how much stuff is actually being used to pay for shopping. And remember, even if you're using a credit card, you're eventually settling it with a cash or check. So the next question is, how much stuff is out there poised, about ready to be converted into a spendable form? This is near money. And it includes, well, first of all, your savings account. It includes also certificates of deposits, especially the small ones that consumers use when they're saving for things. It also includes the money market mutual fund shares that you hold. Maybe you have a money market account that you use ever so often, writing a check to transfer into your account, your checking account, whenever you need to pay tuition or something like that. All of these measures, these broader measures of money, are called M2. M2 includes everything that's in M1 plus these additional instruments. See, these measures of money are inclusive. M1 is the narrowest measure, and M2 includes everything that's in M1 as well as some other stuff. In this case, savings accounts, certificates of deposit, and money market shares that are held by households. Finally, there's one more layer to this. We now can add other things that are less frequently used for shopping but represent a store of wealth that will be used for shopping before too long. These include larger CDs. CDs in an amount over $100,000 count as large negotiable CDs. Frequently, these are used to settle businesses between banks. Also included in this near money measure is repurchase agreements. These are arrangements where businesses lend their checking accounts overnight to banks so that banks can invest them and earn a little bit of interest in the global markets overnight. These repurchase agreements are secured by treasury bills. That is, the bank gives IBM treasury bills overnight in exchange for IBM's checking account. In the morning, the transaction is reversed. The treasury bills go back to the bank, and IBM gets their checking account to do their business transactions with. These larger and less liquid, that is harder to convert to cash, forms of savings are part of M3. M3 is the broadest measure of money that the Fed tracks in its effort to figure out how much stuff is actually available to support shopping. So M3 includes everything that's in M2 as well as larger CDs, that is CDs in amounts over 100,000, repurchase agreements, the money market mutual fund shares that are held by businesses and pension funds, insurance companies, and other financial institutions, as well as Eurodollar deposits, that is money that's held in overseas branches of U.S. banks. Put that all together with the savings accounts and small CDs and the currency, coins, and traveler's checks, and you've got M3. M3 is the broadest measure of money that the Fed watches. Now, M3 adds up to about $6.5 trillion. That is, if you include everything that's either payable to the pizza boy or could be converted into a checking account relatively quickly, you've got a lot of purchasing power circulating in the economy in the form of money. So, the Fed measures the money supply, and we're going to be studying soon how the Fed controls the amount of money that's actually in circulation. But this is an important thing to know, because the amount of money helps the economy, or there's an amount of money that's right for the economy. It helps the economy do its business. Too much and you get inflation, too little and you could get a recession. Hey, Joe. How are you? Very good, thank you. I came to the grocery store today knowing in advance that I don't have any money. That is, there's no cash in my wallet. And time was this would be a big problem at the grocery store. Nowadays, however, there are lots of ways to pay for your groceries. I could write a personal check, but that's going to have problems. Joe's going to be concerned about whether the check is good, which means he's got to go to the trouble of calling the bank or using a check verification service. I then have to worry about whether someone at the store might use my check unscrupulously, maybe photocopy it and try to pass it off as their own. So checks are convenient, but they've got risks. I could also use a credit card, but the credit card doesn't finally settle this transaction. A credit card is just my way of making a short-term loan to myself, which I have to pay off at the end of the month, either by writing a check or directing my bank to take the money from my account and give it to the credit card company. So that just puts off the day of reckoning. I could, however, also use a debit card. A debit card would electronically take the money out of my checking account. Joe likes that because then he doesn't have to worry about the risk. The money shows up immediately. But debit cards make me nervous. Not only do I lose the float, that is, I lose interest till the end of the month like I get with my credit card, but what if somebody found this card and figured out my personal identification number? A lot of money could come out of my checking account very quickly. So I kind of keep this in a safe place. Although it is convenient, again, there's still risks associated with it. Money is getting easier and easier to use as innovations in technology and creativity create new forms in which we can settle transactions at the grocery store. One of the hottest ideas in payments these days is electronic cash, or e-cash. And the forms that it takes look a lot like debit cards and credit cards, physical forms that we're used to. Only nowadays what we're getting are called electronic wallets. They're cards with little computer chips on them. And you take these chips to machines, kiosks at a shopping center or a post office, plug in your card and enter your PIN number and have money downloaded from your checking account directly to this computer chip. Now I can take this card to any store that has a chip reader and pay as if I had cash. Plug it in and enter the amount I want to pay, and it's transferred directly to Joe's account. I can see right here on the screen how much money is being taken off my card, so I have the confidence of knowing I'm not being defrauded, and Joe knows that he's also in a situation that's safe. It's great. Plus, if I lose the card, I don't lose my whole bank account. I lose only the cash that I downloaded onto this card. So I'll keep it in a safe place, just like I'd keep the green folding stuff. Electronic cash doesn't even have to be administered by banks. People who get credit from me, either by me giving them my credit card number or me writing them a check or any form in which I can transfer money to them, can then watch my money for me. Any company could issue these chip cards. In fact, on the internet nowadays, you have companies that use electronic cash. They get credit from my credit card or a check that I send to them, and then they dole out money to the people from whom I buy things online. When I buy books or computer parts or CDs, they take care of settling the payments by transferring money electronically to the accounts of those businesses. E-cash, chip cards, online money being sent around in wires. This is the direction things are going, and banks don't even have to be involved. More and more, the payment system can be run by non-bank companies. Remember, a bank is a financial intermediary that makes loans as well as accepting deposits, but the payment system eventually can circumvent banks entirely. In fact, it doesn't even have to involve dollars at all. We could have commerce that's settled in frequent flyer miles or long-distance telephone minutes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why is it that electronic commerce isn't already entirely ruling shopping? Why isn't e-cash the payments norm everywhere? There's certainly great benefits to e-cash. One of the benefits is it doesn't involve paper checks. Paper checks are very expensive. It takes about $5 billion worth of human labor and resources a year to truck those checks around and get them cleared from one bank to the next, whereas electronic commerce is relatively inexpensive. Once you've got these payments readers installed at stores, it costs almost nothing for me to pay Joe using a chip card. Another thing is I don't have to worry about the fraud involved with checks, and Joe doesn't have to worry about any fraud from his employees taking paper money out of the cash register at night. A lot of the fraud that's involved with paper payments is completely eliminated. Some other advantages are it's very, very convenient. It seems like I've always got my card with me, and it's very easy to carry around. The reason e-cash isn't the norm nowadays is there are costs and risks associated with it that we still as a culture haven't gotten over. One is that there is some concern about security. Think about the difference between car crashes and airplane crashes. Car crashes happen all the time, but because relatively few people are involved in any single accident, they don't make the headline news. Whereas plane crashes, which are very, very rare, make the headlines because a lot of people are involved in the catastrophe and are affected. Now, paper checks are fraudulently used every day, and cash is stolen every day, but that doesn't make the headlines. But if somebody hacks in to an e-cash computer somewhere and messes with the payment system, that's all over the front pages because it's a big, catastrophic and focal news event. So fraud with e-cash is probably going to be less common and maybe less damaging overall, but because it's scary and it strikes at the heart of our confidence in the payments mechanism, it tends to be bigger news. So there are certainly security questions about whether hackers could mess with an e-cash system. Another thing about e-cash that gets people worked up is privacy. I mean, do we really want the government knowing everywhere we spend our money? But with these chip cards now, there can be anonymity built in. I can download the cash from my account, and maybe the account number doesn't come with it. So whenever I come to the store and use my chip card, I can pay without necessarily having to give my name. Once you can have anonymity involved with eCash, then it has a lot of the advantages of the green folding stuff. And eventually it'll replace the green folding stuff because people are going to wonder, if you're carrying cash around, what kind of transactions are you doing anyway? Embarrassing or illicit stuff that you don't want to leave an electronic record of? What have you got to hide? Why not transparency? Another concern with eCash is that once the banking system is circumvented, the Federal Reserve loses its control over the money supply. And certainly once we start using frequent flyer miles and long-distance telephone minutes as cash, the Fed is in a really tough position as far as controlling the payments mechanism or the money supply. And that can be a very big concern, because then how do we control inflation and interest rates and other macroeconomic policy variables? Another concern is concern about taxes, concern about criminal activities, all kinds of things that have particular concern for eCash in ways that paper money doesn't raise the same set of questions. So what will money eventually become? Chip cards are a great new development that are going to catch on more and more as people see that they can be convenient and anonymous and very safe to use. However, ultimately, money is an idea. Money is a stream of zeros and ones out there floating through the ether. It's just numbers on a balance sheet. And so, why do I need a card at all? Why can't some very smart reader pick up all the information it needs from me, including all my account information, from some simple bit of biometric data, so that whenever I show up to the grocery store, all I have to do is identify myself, give my approval to the transaction, and it's all settled. Thanks, Joe. Have a good day. We've been talking about the money market and the decision that households make about how to hold their wealth. How much of your wealth do you want to hold in the form of transactions balances, that is cash and checks and things you can go shopping with? And how much of your wealth do you want to hold in the form of interest-bearing assets? See, the money market is about making the decision about how to divide your wealth between these two forms. So in order to understand the money market better, let's focus our attention now on the world of interest-bearing assets. And that means we're going to be talking about finance. Finance means any activity that involves borrowing, lending, or sharing risk. Let's look at what happens in a financial market. In a financial market, we have borrowers meeting lenders. Borrowers are any agents who have investment opportunities, but who lack the cash to get those projects started. For instance, businesses might have an opportunity to make a profit if they could only borrow the money to build a factory. The government has the opportunity to build roads and bridges, but it's going to need to borrow the money to get those projects done. And finally, homeowners, that is, people who'd like to buy a house and live in it, would be happy to do the transaction, but they're going to have to borrow money in the form of a mortgage before they can get their house off the ground. So, borrowers are people who have projects, ideas, but don't have cash on hand to pull them off. Lenders, on the other hand, are people who have surplus cash and are looking for an opportunity to earn interest. They're looking for an opportunity to earn a rate of return on their money, but they don't have projects that they would like to do themselves. Therefore, getting lenders and borrowers together is an opportunity to make the economic pie bigger. And once these projects are underway, the borrowers can share their profits with the lenders. That's what happens in a financial market. Let's look at the flow of funds in a financial market. What happens in this financial market is that lenders send cash to borrowers so that they can purchase plant, equipment, houses, road crews, and things like that to create the assets out of which profits are made. In return, the borrowers give the lenders an IOU. Now, this term IOU is not an acronym that stands for anything. It's a rebus. It's a word picture. I owe you money. And an IOU is a financial security or a financial instrument. That is, it's a contract that explains what the lender is entitled to, at what date in the future, under what circumstances. That is, it tells the world and the lender what money to expect in the future as a result of this deal that the lender and the borrower have made. Now, there are all different kinds of IOUs. There are bonds, which are debt contracts that entitle the lender to a fixed interest payment in the future. And that's the way most other loans work too. Even if it's not a bond, the loan entitles you to a fixed interest payment if it's a debt instrument. There are also particular kinds of loans called treasury bills that are issued by the United States government. These are short-term instruments that the government uses to finance its debt, and they entitle the lender to an interest payment within a year. There are also stock instruments, and stock or equity contracts entitle the lender to a share of the profits of this business venture at some date in the future, usually paid in the form of dividends. Now, the borrower and the lender can get together directly, in which case they're engaging in a transaction we call direct finance. That's what would happen if you bought a share of IBM stock directly yourself from a broker, or if you lent your sister money so that she could buy a car. That's direct finance, where the borrower and lender deal with one another directly, face to face, or through a broker. However, rather than going into the world of direct finance, you may want to reduce your search cost. That is, you may not want to spend time going out and looking for someone with a good project. Plus, there's risk involved. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. On top of that, you're going to have to draw up a contract and monitor compliance, and all of that's going to involve a lot of transactions effort that you may want to spare yourself. Therefore, you're going to go through what's called a financial intermediary, and that's an agent in the economy that specializes in bringing lenders and borrowers together. A financial intermediary is defined by its balance sheet. So let's take a look here at a balance sheet. A balance sheet tells you two things. It tells you what you own, that is your assets, and it tells you what you owe, that is your liabilities. That is, if you own something, then the money to purchase that came from somewhere, that is, you probably borrowed it. A financial intermediary is an institution that simultaneously borrows and lends. In particular, a financial intermediary is an agent that borrows from the ultimate lenders, that is, households put money on deposit with the financial intermediary, and the financial intermediary then funnels that money or lends it to the people in the economy, the borrowers who have the projects who can earn profits from this savings. Let's look at some examples of financial intermediaries, and I think it will make clearer what's going on in this process. One example of a financial intermediary is a bank. This is one you're probably very familiar with. A bank borrows money from households, and it gets households to lend money by offering them deposits in a form that's attractive. What people want when they go to the bank are transactions balances, like checking accounts, or opportunities to earn a little bit of interest by putting your money in a savings account that you can take out whenever you want. People are attracted to savings accounts and checking accounts because they're liquid. Liquid means easily convertible into cash without any risk. Now, when the bank gets all this money deposited by households, it goes and makes loans. Loans to businesses, loans to people who are building houses in the form of mortgages, and sometimes they'll even hold treasury bills, which means they are indirectly making a loan to the government. Now, if you are in a savings and loan institution, you are probably lending most of your money to houses, because savings and loan institutions typically lend at least 3/4 of their money in the form of mortgages. There are also credit unions, which lend most of their money to their own members, and mutual savings banks, which are less and less common. So, banks are one kind of financial intermediary. They stand between lenders and borrowers. Another example of a financial intermediary is a mutual fund. Now, here's the way the mutual fund works. People go to a mutual fund and they invest their money there. They put their money on deposit because the mutual fund offers them a diversified portfolio. That is, you get a mutual fund statement which tells the fund you're invested in, and once you look at the prospectus for that fund, you can see that it involves the holding of thousands of shares of stock in thousands of different companies. What the mutual fund typically does is it buys stock in thousands of different companies, and since you own a share of of the mutual fund, you own a little piece of each of these thousands of companies. Rather than putting all of your eggs in one basket by making a big loan to one company, you can put your money in a mutual fund, get a statement and a share of that mutual fund, and own a little piece of the stocks of thousands of different companies. The mutual fund diversifies for you. That is, it goes to the trouble of locating lots of good investments and gives you a little piece of each one so as to minimize your risk. Another example of a financial intermediary is an insurance company. And an insurance company works this way. The insurance company buys bonds of companies, and it offers the people who have deposited there insurance policies, many of which have an annuity component. An annuity is like a financial instrument. It's like a savings account. You've heard of life insurance policies maturing. Well, when you buy a whole life policy, what you're doing is you're engaging in a kind of savings activity. When your whole life policy matures, you're entitled to receive your savings with interest at a date in the future. So the insurance company takes the money that you've deposited and pays you a rate of return on the money that you've paid in. All of the money that you've paid in the form of premiums and annuity investments gets invested in companies as the insurance company buys bonds. Now, insurance companies work on the principle of actuarial science. That is, they look at the statistics on accidents and life expectancy, and they can calculate pretty precisely exactly how much money they're going to have to pay out each year. That means they can afford to invest the bulk of the money that's deposited there into very long-term investments that typically pay higher rates of return. That's why insurance company annuities are usually a relatively attractive investment for lenders. Also, they have good tax consequences and protection from certain kinds of taxes. One more kind of financial intermediary is the pension fund. The pension fund, again, stands between lenders and borrowers, and it offers lenders retirement accounts and pensions. That is, it plays a role in people's retirement planning. Then the pension fund itself invests this money into the stocks of lots of companies. That is, it engages in diversification. The pension fund knows when it's going to have money to pay people who are approaching their retirement years, so it can also do some long-term planning and leave its money invested in the stock market looking for the best possible return. Now, you've seen several examples of financial intermediaries. Financial intermediaries engage in bringing lenders and borrowers together and doing so in a form that makes the terms more attractive for both sides. Well, think about what's happening here. People are putting money into financial intermediaries, or they're buying bonds. What they're doing is they are saving. And all of the money that goes into financial markets comes out the other side. That is, it's borrowed by businesses or the government or households who are making investment decisions, building houses, building factories, building roads. Savings equals investment. Everything that goes in comes out. With that insight, it's easy to see how the financial system is related to the rest of the economy. Consider these equations. Let Y stand for income. Now, what can you do with your income? You can consume it, save it, or spend it on taxes. And since everyone in the economy is in the same position, all income in the economy winds up as consumer spending, savings, or tax payments. Now, think also about income. Income is received whenever you produce goods and services, and all the goods and services that are produced have to be purchased by someone, whether consumers, businesses in the form of investment spending, the government, or foreigners in the form of our net exports. Now, this income that's equal to the sum of its uses, and this income that's equal to the total of all spending are the same income. So set them equal to each other, and you get these equations. This equation set equal to this one. Cancel the C off and do a little rearrangement, and you get this remarkable statement, which is that all of the investment spending, all the money that businesses are borrowing in order to purchase plant, equipment, and other capital goods, all of that business spending is someone else's saving, whether the saving of households, the saving of the government, that is the amount by which tax payments exceed government spending or the government's budget surplus, or whether it's our trade deficit, that is the money that foreigners are lending us so that we can buy more of their goods than they buy of ours. These three forms of saving, private saving, public saving, and foreign saving, have to be equal by accounting to the amount of investment spending that businesses do. And that's the link between the real economy and the financial system.